If you look at Britain on a map today, it seems small, almost insignificant, just a cluster of islands off the coast of Europe. You'd be forgiven for thinking its influence ends there. But zoom out, look closer at the world, and a different picture begins to emerge. Scattered across the globe are 14 overseas territories, remnants of a far greater past. From Gibraltar, standing guard at the entrance to the Mediterranean, to the remote Falkland Islands in the South Atlantic. These distant lands are the final echoes of something much bigger. Because not long ago, just over a century in the past, Britain was not small, it was unstoppable. At its peak, the British Empire controlled nearly a quarter of the Earth's land and ruled over almost a third of humanity. An empire so vast, the sun never set upon it. But how did this happen? How did a relatively small island nation rise to dominate the globe, building the largest empire in human history? To understand that, we have to go back to a time before Britain even existed as a unified state. Because the story of the British Empire doesn't begin with an empire at all. It begins with a kingdom. For centuries, the dominant power in the British Isles was the Kingdom of England, a nation steadily growing in strength, with a developing economy and an increasingly powerful military. And from these foundations, an empire would rise. England's rise to power was gradual. During the medieval period, it expanded its control, absorbing Wales and extending its influence into Ireland. But Scotland remained fiercely independent, resisting repeated English invasions. By the early 1600s, England began looking beyond Europe. Under Queen Elizabeth I, explorers like Sir Francis Drake and Sir Martin Frobisher claimed distant lands, but early efforts to settle them failed, most famously at Roanoke, where an entire colony vanished without a trace. So England changed its strategy, like the Levant Company and the East India Company, granting them monopolies over trade and the resources to expand overseas. Then, in 1603, a major shift occurred. After Elizabeth's death, James VI of Scotland became King of England, uniting the two crowns under one ruler. Though both kingdoms remained separate, with renewed ambition, James pushed for permanent colonies, carefully structured and governed. Some would be crown colonies, ruled directly by the monarch, through appointed governors. This time, England wasn't just exploring the world, it was preparing to control it. But not all colonies were governed the same way. Some were crown colonies, others, known as charter colonies, operated under corporate charters, giving settlers far greater political freedom. And then, there were proprietary colonies, essentially private ventures, controlled by individuals or companies, run for profit, often from afar. But over time, these systems proved difficult to manage. Many would eventually fall back under direct royal control. Meanwhile, a crucial experiment was unfolding much closer to home. In Ireland, the plantation of Ulster saw Protestant settlers relocated from England and Scotland to the north. It was a bold attempt at organized colonization, and it worked. More importantly, it became a blueprint. The strategies used in Ulster would later shape England's expansion across the Atlantic, as many of its architects carried their experience into the New World, and expand they did. Throughout the 1600s, England rapidly grew its presence in North America and the Caribbean, founding new colonies and seizing others from rival powers. In 1665, the English captured New York from the Dutch, another step in a growing global empire. England was no longer experimenting, it was advancing. As England expanded its reach, it also built vast trading networks, stretching into Africa and the East Indies. Along these coasts, fortified trading posts known as factories became the backbone of a growing global economy. At the center of this system, stood the Royal African Company, founded in 1660. It would go on to dominate one of the darkest chapters in human history, the transatlantic slave trade, fueling immense profits at an immeasurable human cost. But England was not alone in its ambitions. To the north, Scotland watched and wanted in. Eager to compete, it launched its own colonial ventures across the Atlantic. But unlike England, success never came. Colonies in Nova Scotia, Cape Breton, and Carolina all failed, fragile, short-lived, and ultimately abandoned. Then came Scotland's boldest gamble. In 1698, it launched the Darien Scheme, a daring plan to establish a colony on the Isthmus of Panama, controlling trade between the Atlantic and the Pacific. The stakes were enormous. Nearly a fifth of Scotland's national wealth was poured into the project. When the expedition finally arrived, they named their colony Caledonia and began building a settlement they called New Edinburgh. It was a dream of empire, but it would soon become a nightmare. The dream unraveled quickly. The colony was doomed from the start, crippled by food shortages, ravaged by tropical disease, and constantly threatened by Spanish forces. It didn't stand a chance. Even after a resupply mission in 1699, nothing could save it. The settlement was abandoned. Of the 2,500 settlers who had set out, only a few hundred returned to Scotland. The rest were lost. What followed was catastrophe. The failure of the Darien Scheme wiped out vast amounts of wealth, plunging Scotland into a deep financial crisis. And for many, a harsh reality set in. If Scotland wanted to survive and compete, could not do it alone. Its future, it seemed, lay with England and its growing empire. By the early 18th century, the two nations were. Mary and her husband, William of Orange, ruled together as monarchs of both England and Scotland. Yet tensions remained. In England, new laws ensured only Protestants could inherit the throne, but in Scotland, those laws did not apply. This divide pushed the two kingdoms closer to a historic turning point. By the early 1700s, pressure to unite had reached its peak. Under Queen Anne, efforts intensified to secure a stable Protestant succession. Then, in 1707, it finally happened. The Acts of Union were passed, and England and Scotland became one nation, Great Britain. But unity was only the beginning. Britain soon found itself in global conflicts, fighting across Europe and beyond. When the War of the Spanish Succession ended in 1714, Britain emerged victorious, gaining Newfoundland, Acadia, Gibraltar, and Minorca, strategic gateways that strengthened its growing empire. Meanwhile, in the East, the British East India Company was expanding its own power. In 1757, at the Battle of Plassey, it seized control of Bengal, marking a turning point. No longer just a trading company, it became a ruling force, using diplomacy, influence, and military strength to expand its reach across the Indian subcontinent. Britain's power was strengthened through war. Conflicts like the War of the Austrian Succession, and most importantly, the 7 Years' War, reshaped the global balance. Britain emerged on top. In North America, the capture of Quebec in 1759 marked the fall of French power. By 1760, New France had collapsed, Spain ceded Florida, and Britain controlled most of the eastern coastline. The Treaty of Paris in 1763 confirmed it, adding valuable Caribbean islands and securing Britain's place as the world's leading naval and colonial power. This empire was built on two forces: naval supremacy and commerce. Control of the seas meant control of trade, while a vast global network brought immense wealth to Britain. But this system also planted the seeds of rebellion, because it relied heavily on taxation. In America, the 13 colonies grew restless. They were taxed but denied representation. Tensions rose through the 1760s and 1770s, with one powerful message: no taxation without representation. What began as protests soon became war. By 1775, rebellion had begun. In 1776, colonial leaders declared independence. forming a new nation. After 8 years of fighting, Britain was defeated. The United States of America had won its freedom, and for the British Empire, it marked a turning point. The loss of America was devastating, but it also marked a turning point. Britain shifted its focus to new frontiers: Asia, the Pacific, and Africa. The empire would rise again, but in a different form. In the years that followed, exploration led the way. Captain James Cook charted vast stretches of the Pacific, claiming lands like New Zealand and the eastern coast of Australia. Though he was killed in Hawaii, his voyages opened the door to a new era of expansion. Australia soon became a penal colony. In 1788, the first fleet arrived in New South Wales, and for decades Britain sent its convicts there, reshaping the continent. At the same time, explorers such as George Vancouver and Alexander Mackenzie pushed into North America, expanding British influence and unlocking the fur trade. But as Britain expanded, so did its enemies. In 1803, war with France erupted again, this time under Napoleon Bonaparte. Britain relied on its greatest strength, the Royal Navy. The decisive moment came in 1805 at the Battle of Trafalgar. Britain defeated the combined French and Spanish fleets, securing control of the seas. Though Admiral Lord Nelson was killed, his victory ensured British naval dominance for generations and secured the future of the empire. When the Napoleonic Wars ended in 1815, Britain's naval dominance paid off. As part of the victorious coalition, it claimed territories across the globe, from Malta and the Ionian Islands to Mauritius, the Seychelles, and the Cape Colony. From Trinidad and Tobago to Guyana and Ceylon, the empire expanded once again. Many of these lands, especially in the Caribbean, relied on plantation economies built on enslaved labor. For decades, this system generated immense wealth, but change was coming. The Industrial Revolution shifted Britain's focus toward domestic production, while growing pressure from abolitionists led to reform. In 1807, the slave trade was abolished, and in 1834, slavery itself was ended, marking a major moral and economic turning point. From 1815 to 1914, Britain entered its imperial century, a time of unmatched global power. In Asia, expansion accelerated. The British East India Company strengthened its control over India, while new footholds emerged across the region. Singapore was founded in 1819, and after the First Opium War in 1842, Britain seized Hong Kong and opened key Chinese ports to trade. But rising power brought resistance. In 1857, Indian soldiers, known as sepoys, rebelled against British rule. The uprising was crushed, but it changed everything. In 1858, the British government dissolved the East India Company and took direct control of India, turning it into the empire's most important possession. India became Britain's most prized possession, the jewel in the crown. But even as the empire tightened its grip, new threats emerged. To the north, Russia was expanding towards Central Asia and weakening Ottoman lands. Britain responded. In 1853, the Crimean War began, and by 1856, Russia was defeated. Yet the rivalry continued in a tense struggle known as the Great Game. Britain ed its position elsewhere. It gained Cyprus in 1878, expanded across Africa, and after defeating the Boers in 1902, secured vast southern territories. In 1869, the Suez Canal transformed global trade, and Britain occupied Egypt in 1882 to protect this vital route. By the late 19th century, the scramble for Africa was in full swing. Britain controlled agromus regions, with ambitions as bold as a railway from Cape to Cairo. This was the empire at its peak, global and unmatched. At the dawn of the 20th century, Britain stood as the world's leading power, connected by vast trade and communication networks. Yet change was coming. Dominions like Canada, Australia, and New Zealand gained self-government, while Ireland pushed for independence. Then came World War I. Millions from across the empire fought. Victory was secured, but at a devastating cost. Britain emerged weakened, and cracks began to show. After World War II, the empire could no longer hold. One by one, colonies gained independence in a wave known as the Wind of Change. After nearly 400 years, the British Empire came to an end. Yet its legacy endured. Many former colonies remained connected through the Commonwealth, and in 1997, the handover of Hong Kong marked the symbolic close of empire. Today, its impact still shapes the world, from language and culture to global institutions. The empire is gone, but its story lives on.